In my last video, we discussed the idea of modern buildings and places working well when reserved for a few special locations, scattered throughout a classical and traditional environment, but only when a very high standard can be maintained. But what about exceptional modernism en masse? If a genius architect can design an objectively beautiful modernist building that serves as a destination and a place people want and look forward to going to, then can the same level of architect design whole districts or even cities this way? Meaning, can modern cities be just as beautiful, enjoyable, inspiring, and cultural as traditional ones? And perhaps the more complicated question, should we build more of them? Downtown Vancouver is a truly unique and gripping urban landscape. While there is a historical core with beautiful 19th century brick buildings along commercial streets, the surrounding apartments and office buildings form this iconic theme of tall glass buildings. Whatever your thoughts are on skyscrapers, it must be said that these buildings are certainly a cut above the skyscrapers you'll see in other urban cores. And we'll get more into that in just a bit. But take a look at Vancouver's skyline as opposed to other places, and you can definitely see that there's more to appreciate. But unlike other downtowns in North America with tall buildings, there is also plenty of gaps between these structures with luscious green space. This city design style has come to be known as vancouverism. But impressive modern-style urban cores extend beyond British Columbia. Another example is Tel Aviv, which has a very iconic skyline along the warm Mediterranean coast. People are seen taking photographs of the skyline all throughout the city, and it adds to the pride of the city and really the entire country of Israel. A lot of the reasons why I praise and encourage the use of traditional architecture is for a lot of the same reasons these places are also great. To start, they are very popular amongst residents and have added local character, pride, and culture to their cities. One of the biggest problems with modernist architecture all around the world is that it tends to be bleak, uninspiring, and not rooted in any form of local character. This makes these places boring and soulless, and have served as a backdrop to the drudgery of modern living that has been commented on so aggressively in all forms of media. People don't really want to live in these places, but they do because the places that aren't like that have become scarce and high in demand with insane prices, or perhaps dangerous like in the inner cities of the US, or lacking in industry like in Italy or small towns around Europe come to mind. But the culture created by the architecture, even if modern, in Vancouver and Tel Aviv, is very real and appropriate. Vancouver is set in one of the most beautiful natural landscapes in the world, known as Fraser Valley. It is surrounded by mountains, the Pacific Ocean, and lush arable grasslands. Therefore, the buildings of downtown Vancouver are meant to reflect that backdrop, with the glass meant to almost camouflage into the scenery and provide residents with some of the best views you can ask for. Leaving plenty of green space on the ground level too only adds to this character. It's dense living, yet you feel more intact with nature and the surrounding environment than just about any other large city in the world. And that in itself is an amazing achievement and is an authentic source of identity and culture that architecture is meant to provide. And for Tel Aviv, it is a similar idea, but it's all about the beach. The waterfront itself is such a friendly and open space that everybody wants to be there. You really feel like you're at the center of the world while you're there. So it's no wonder the city has to line these tall buildings up against the beach in order to meet its extremely high demand. Now, I understand a lot of you might still criticize the exact architectural work of some of these buildings, and I think we can all agree that it's not always perfect. For example, I think Vancouver still has too many mid-century ugly buildings, and on street level, the newer buildings can be quite lacking. But these places are still success stories, and what we learn from these places is that what's most important in creating great cities is having an organic theme to the buildings and cityscape that suits the local demand, as well as leaving a lot of the ground level dedicated to public space and recreation. Urbanists refer to this as a third place, if where you live is the first place and where you work is your second place. Boring cities lack a third place because the ground level is made up of wide roads, parking lots, and freeways, and little room for anything else. So you might be thinking, well then, as long as there's plenty of third places and buildings are at least better than that of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, then that's how we'll make great places. What's the point of all this talk about traditional architecture if it's so unnecessary? But slow your horses, because there's more to the story. Both Vancouver and Tel Aviv are, in the grand scheme of things, new. Vancouver was only established in the 1880s and Tel Aviv in the 1920s. Therefore, these cities had a chance to establish their origin stories, if you will, with a basis in modernity. The erecting of the high-rises of Vancouver and Tel Aviv were the cities becoming themselves. Meanwhile, looking at a place like London, which seeks to build its own bland high-rises in the more underdeveloped parts of the city, this comes with much more concern and criticism. Why build a new urban core in London that has nothing to do with London or anything that came before it? Vancouver and Tel Aviv were able to work with their own blank canvas. They had the freedom to establish their own cities as products of their time. London has too much going for it to be able to rewrite its rulebook effectively, and it's not a good idea to neglect the thousands of years of history, tradition, and refinement in order to create new high-rise blocks that look like this. These buildings within London are out of context. And something that I really appreciate about Vancouver and Tel Aviv is they had the opportunity to make their own modern context as the central theme, but still did so in a way that actually makes sense with their landscapes and holds unique aesthetic value. And the other very important element is how ingrained with tradition and culture these cities actually are. Vancouver's commercial streets and districts scattered throughout its downtown and surrounding areas that maintain beautiful traditional buildings that ground the city in its short history and industrial Canadian background. Go on Google Images and look up best streets in Vancouver, best places to shop in Vancouver, best nightlife, all the third place sort of stuff, and it's these streets and buildings that come up, not the modern ones. So while Vancouver built a modern facade and lifestyle that is truly unique and in some ways beautiful, it also doesn't mess around with what works on the ground level, the kind of places where people actually want to be to enjoy their city, places with traditional architecture. And thankfully, there are quite a lot of preserved areas, but I do think Vancouver would do well to add to this and have its glass high-rises on the ground level have more traditional and highly detailed themes, rather than the duller modern themes most have today. Tel Aviv takes it a couple steps further than Vancouver. It neighbors the ancient Jaffa port, which is a really cool spot. Unfortunately, a lot of it was destroyed around a century ago, but what still remains is still iconic and eye-catching. That doesn't stop me from wanting them to rebuild the destroyed parts of Jaffa as it once was, because we need more ancient cities intact in the world. But that aside, Tel Aviv still feels like a natural continuation of that history, rather than an abandonment of it. Most of Tel Aviv's buildings use limestone, which is the building material of Israel, and for thousands of years. Whether it's a traditional or modern building, the use of limestone brings the city together and builds on Israeli culture, history, and aesthetic. The use of local materials is a major part of any traditional architectural style all over the world. My favorite example is how the stone in England is a brown color, but in Scotland is gray. To know why, check out Jay Foreman's video about the England-Scotland border. But this difference in stone type adds so much identity and richness to the aesthetics of these places. And no doubt, over time has had a major cultural impact. Due to globalization in building materials, the importance and value of using local materials has been forgotten about, or at least never realized. But with an exception being Tel Aviv. It's amazing, but there are also neighborhoods in Tel Aviv that take on this unique but more traditionally Mediterranean aesthetic. What's really cool about Neve Tzedek is that most of it was developed in the 1990s and 2000s, yet it feels much older and in the best possible way. So, while Tel Aviv is not even 100 years old, the city holds on to a lot more history and traditionalism in its buildings and streets than in older cities, such as LA, Houston, Tokyo, and Seoul. The ultra-modern high-rises are dedicated to only certain parts of the city, and most of Tel Aviv is somewhere along the lines of traditional or some sort of traditional modern hybrid. It's made its mistakes too, just like Vancouver, but both of these cities tell us modernism still only thrives with a traditional foundation, even when you're talking about two of the newest cities in the world. There are going to be circumstances where modernism en masse can happen, and in a way that looks beautiful, suits its environment, and captivates those worldwide and locally. However, even places that do this better than anywhere else need traditionalism as the glue that binds the culture and vibrancy of the city together. Traditionalism, or something closely based off of it, is still the only way to make places that are on a human scale and add that element of culture and feeling of legacy that humans long for and are always drawn towards. Even when we build new, revolutionary places, Abandoning what was once refined over centuries will always leave places with a feeling of emptiness and isolation, which Vancouver and Tel Aviv have done so well to not fall into. Something as simple as just a color or type of stone goes a long way, and we should all keep this in mind as the world continues to build and new places develop.